Welcome everybody to this podcast. I'm Arlette.
My name is Francisca.
And we are studying business engineer. So today we'll be talking about economy, institutions, and economic development. But we also have another guest, James Robinson. Can you present yourself? Yeah.
Thank you. My name is James Robinson. I'm a university professor at the University of Chicago.
We have knowledge that you've been studying for years. You've studied in Harvard and Yale, right?
I studied at the London School of Economics and Yale. I was formerly a professor at Harvard.
That's really impressive. We wanted to know what inspired you to study economics and what sparked the interest to be passionate about this.
Well, I think when I was a child, I grew up in England in the 1970s. I was very interested in politics, actually. My mother was a socialist, and she was very passionate about social problems and social interests. And we would talk about that every night, at home. We didn't have a television, so we would just talk about politics and society. And so actually when I went to study in London, I was going to study political science, but it was 1979 and Mrs. Thatcher had just been elected. Ronald Reagan was elected the next year, I guess. And so I was very interested in politics, but I'd go to a political meeting and everybody was talking about economics. Everyone was talking about the money supply and talking about the market. And so I thought, Mrs. Thatcher famously bought every member of her cabinet Friedrich Hayek's Road to Serfdom and Milton Friedman's Capitalism, I don't remember what it's called, Capitalism and Freedom, or Freedom and Capitalism. So I realized I need to study some economics, So I started taking economics classes, and then I realized, this is fascinating. And I had a fantastic this professor called Mikia Moroshima, who was very inspiring. And he asked all these big questions about the world. And so, comparing economics and political science, I saw, economics has a kind of machinery for answering questions. Like for me, political science was like butterfly collecting. Like you find a new butterfly and you name the species and you put it on the wall and you put a pin in it. So like for me, that's like just taxonomy, organized. But economics seemed to be about like asking questions. So I was like, okay, this is for me, and I dropped political science and I switched to economics. And then I studied. I did my doctorate at Yale in the United States. And I just got very absorbed in mastering kind of economic theory and just trying to understand. I didn't really understand it at all. So, but then when I finally understood it, I realized, there's a problem here. Which is there's all these things that I'm kind of passionate about, and there's what economists study. They're almost completely different. So I think if I thought about my career, it's sort of, I still like the tools and the methodology of economics, but mostly I've been interested in questions that economists never studied, or certainly they didn't study 35 years ago. And I've been trying to kind of bring those two things together, trying to study politics and history and institutions and culture and, does that make sense?
Yeah, actually, that's really inspiring. And going back to what you were talking about, institutions, again, same question, but with institutions. What was the beginning of the reason why you began studying institutions, and why is the reason that it's impactful for the economy?
Well, I think, when you learn economics, you learn economic theory, you sort of learn there's individuals, and individuals maximize utility, and there's firms, and firms maximize profits, and then there's markets, and then you learn about competition and the efficiency of resource allocation. And I thought, this is a very weird theory, because it's like, Newton's laws of gravitational motion, force is equal to mass times acceleration. Like economists have this idea that they have this one universal theory, that explains everything and it applies everywhere, today in history. And, before I grew up when I was a child, we lived overseas in West Indies, in Barbados and Trinidad, and then in West Africa. And so I was very kind of passionate about the world and thinking about the world. And it just seemed to me completely implausible that the same theory applied everywhere in the world. These are human beings, not particles. It's not like gas. It's not like Boyle's law of gases. So I just think. So I think this institutions was a sort of language for trying to talk about these differences between different societies and different. And I think like most of what I've been trying to do, over this period is trying to find a kind of more satisfactory set of concepts or ideas to talk about the differences between different societies. Like today I was talking about culture in some sense, and how important culture is for kind of thinking about Latin America and why Latin America is different from North America. So I've been trying to kind of get away from this idea that economics is like theoretical physics, because I don't think it is. Social science is not like that.
Cool. And speaking in Chile, Chile has experienced a process of constitutional change and some other reforms. What impact do you think this could have on the type of institutions that stand out in the country?
Well, I mean, I think you have to think of institutions in a very broad way. I think there's a distinction that people make between formal institutions and informal institutions. So, formal institutions is the law and the constitution, but they're sitting in a lot of other practices and social norms and conventions, people call informal institutions. So I think you have to see the whole kind of picture. For me, I mean, today I was making fun of Latin Americans endlessly rewriting the constitution, thinking that this is going to solve their problems, So, and, one way of thinking about is that, that doesn't solve these more fundamental problems of informal institutions and social norms and things like that. I think it can be useful, and I was giving the example of why there's no carnival in Chile, but it turns out that carnival was made illegal in 1816, so it was actually banned by a law. So sometimes these laws, you can change things. I mean, you can think of lots of examples of laws that or constitutional clauses that did have a progressive effect, and they did, but I think it's very hard to reconfigure society in that way, by just rewriting the constitution. And I think in Chile, with the defeat of the first constitutional project, I think people sort of understood that, first of all, there's huge numbers of unintended consequences. You can't anticipate all the impacts this is going to have of changing this rule and that rule, and so I think. I'm English, we don't even have a constitution in England, so in England you don't have this way of thinking, you don't have this idea that you can kind of reconfigure society like that, because it's just too organic and it's too slow moving, and so I think, I don't think rewriting I think I can understand why it would be symbolically good in Chile to get rid of the constitution that the military wrote. I can see that there's, without thinking this is going to miraculously change society, there's something symbolic about that, and that's probably a good thing, just to do that, for that purpose only. But to say that this is going to improve things, let me give you an example I gave in recently, which is, like people complaining today about the electoral system or the constitution, but think about after the military left in Chile, the Concertación, for over 2 decades there was enormous progress. There was a sort of collective project. There was enormous economic progress with Pinochet's constitution, with Pinochet's electoral system. Because people came together and they, and so that can happen. That can happen again. I don't think you can achieve that just by rewriting the constitution. You achieve it by Chileans coming together and sort of discussing and deliberating and thinking about their problems. And I think this is a moment where there's a lot of kind of decompression, I would say. My wife did her PhD in Chile, and she studied 12 years ago. She did it. She studied. She interviewed hundreds of people who'd been repressed by the military, who'd been imprisoned and tortured, and so she looked at the impact of repression on, people's political participations and people's political kind of ideology. And one thing, that sort of struck her about that is that people were so traumatized. The legacy of the dictatorship, people were traumatized. People were scared of, like, first of all, you had General Pinochet in the Senate, and then people were just scared of rocking the boat, and so that limited a lot of the discussion. But I think that fear has disappeared now. It's disappeared amongst young people. And so now there's a lot more issues on the table. There's more things to talk about that haven't been talked about. And that's a good thing. It's a good thing. But of course, it takes time to adjust to that.
Oh, that's really interesting. Actually, I believe you're right. That's I see the perspective of somebody that's outside from Chile about the Constitution and stuff like that. It's really interesting. I never really had the opinion of somebody else. Again, talking about Chile's perspective, what's your opinion about the evolution of the institutions, of how they have changed throughout the decades?
Yeah, I think Chile has built very strong institutions. For me, it's the country in Latin America which has the best institutions, the best functioning institutions. Think of this example. There's no Odebrecht scandal in Chile. Why is there no Odebrecht scandal? Because there's a proper process, non-corruptible process for getting government contracts that Odebrecht couldn't get anywhere in this country. Again, to go back to my wife's research, she took a sample of people from this Valak report, and you get the Valak report. There's a list of all the people, with their names and their run, their national identity. It's all there. It's out in the open. It's like transparent. She then went to do the same thing in Argentina. In Argentina, you have the same process of it's completely untransparent. There's no list of people. When she started negotiating, people want bribes, and they, it's like that. But that's a simple thing. It just probably doesn't even appear odd to you. That's just the way things work in Chile, but that's not the way things work in Argentina or Colombia or Venezuela or So I think there's lots of examples, and that's something that's been built. It's been built. It was built during the Concertación. I don't think it's some deeply historic Chilean thing. I was talking a little bit about that this morning, but some research I did a long time ago, 15 years ago. I looked at the impact of the introduction of the secret ballot in Chile in the 1950s on the economy and also on voting patterns. And if you go back to the 1950s in Chile, there was huge amounts of kind of clientelism and vote buying in elections. There's none. It's completely disappeared now. And that was, how did that disappear? That's building institutions. It's building. So I don't want to say this is an achievement. The Concertación and So I think there's a lot of institutional strength, and that's important. And the other thing that I, as an outsider, who goes to different parts of Latin America, you notice is that in Chile, the debate, the debate is really about the important issues for the society. In lots of places it isn't. Look, President Maduro in Venezuela just changed the date of Christmas, like this week. I mean, that's not a serious discussion about anything. President Lopez Obrador is on television for 2-3 hours a day talking about nothing. That's, you don't see that in Chile. So that's, for me, that's fantastic. Yes.
I'm thinking that you have these multiple perspectives of different countries in Latin America. Looking towards the future, what priorities should countries focus on to avoid future institutional failure or breakdowns?
I think that's it's complicated. It's hard to build. It's hard to build functioning institutions. I think that's that there's many examples of that in my books. The political challenges of building better institutions. I don't think there's a magic bullet for building stronger institutions. I think democracy is. I think on average, I think you see democracy is associated with better development of institutions in other dimensions, but even that is very complicated, because sometimes democracy can be very clientelistic, or it can be very, populist, or so I don't think there's a recipe. I think for 200 years, in some sense, Latin America has kind of been trapped in this underdevelopment path. And you know, the country in all of those 200 years that's come closest to kind of exiting that is, you know, Chile in the last 30, 40 years, you know, in some sense, you know, because it has institutional strength in, you know, in some dimensions that no other country in Latin America has. Maybe Uruguay. I don't know too much about Uruguay. So that's exciting, but I think Latin America, you know, Chile still suffers from many of the other problems of Latin America, you know, like this very oligarchic, the Chilean society, you know, has this very kind of oligarchic aspect to it, you know. And so I think that somehow you have to exit from that, you know, you have to kind of open up and make the society more inclusive. So going to El Verbo Divino for high school in Santiago becomes like irrelevant and less important. And, you know, but one thing about the conference is sort of interesting also, you know, like talking to people, you know, there's a lot of social mobility here. Like amongst the academics, you meet people from the north and the south, and not everybody's from Santiago, you know. Like there is mobility, and there is, you know, and that's, so there's interesting things going on.
I'm actually from the south. I'm like far from the south, and it's really comforting knowing that Chile like travels a lot, and you can meet people from all the way to north to south, and everybody's mixed up, and it's really amazing. I think you can tell with the kind of people you meet, you know, from where they're from. So now closing a little bit, these last questions. This is going to be more of a section for students or future economics. What do you think are some essential abilities and knowledge that an economist or future businessman should have if they want to positively impact the economy or the country?
Well, I'm not sure I know much about business, so let me not. I don't want to comment on business. You know, I've always been an academic, and I've never worked in the private sector, and I'm not sure I know what's involved. I mean, I think, you know, for academic economists, you know, I think, like, I don't know what's important. You know, I think you know, curiosity about the world is very important. I think, you know, Latin America has suffered a lot from attempts to implement kind of very simplistic, you know, policy recommendations, you know, without knowing anything about the kind of context or caring about the context or the, you know, like think about what President Milei is trying to do in Argentina at the moment, you know. I think it's just like, it's obviously going to be a disaster, but somehow it's still happening, you know, and it's going to be as ineffective, you know, as the Washington Consensus reforms were in Argentina in the 1990s. But there's all these economists advocating it, you know, based on some kind of idealized model of, you know, the world, you know, that we started talking about. So I think the most important thing is, like, you know, study the world, learn the world. Like for me, you know, one of the great things about being an academic is just this, you know, studying the world. Like I always tell, I taught for 30 years in Colombia in the summer, and when my Colombian students come to the United States, I tell them, like, don't write your dissertation on Colombia. Like you're at Harvard, you're at MIT, you're wherever it is. You know, you're at one of the world's great universities. You can do anything you like. Don't study Colombia. Study somewhere else. You know, like Colombia is fascinating, but you know, that's not a recommendation for not understanding Colombia. No, actually, you understand Colombia better when you see it in comparative perspective, and you see it, like you were saying, you know, like you see it from outside. You see things that you'd never see if you just focused on Colombia. So I think, like, you know, to me, to be a good economist is someone who, like, knows a lot about the world, and, like, you know, and the problems of different societies and the cultures and institutions of different societies, and also, you know, when it comes to, you know, you're talking about improving institutions, you know, the place I'd start is, like, let's look at countries that actually improved their institutions and figure out, how did they do that? You know, like, how did South Korea do that? You know, what did they do, and how did they get it right? I mean, one of the first countries I started studying, you know, I worked a lot for the last 25 years in Africa, and I just got super interested in, like, Botswana. So, you know, this was like one of the fastest growing economies in the world in the last 50 years. How can there be a country in Africa that's so economically successful? And then I figured out that, like, nobody had an answer to that. Like, I took all the books on Botswana out of the library. There's not that many, you won't be surprised to hear. I read them, you know, in less than a week, and I was like, there's no explanation here. Okay, now what do I do? Okay, I'm going to go to Botswana. You know, I went to Botswana. They may not know, but they'll have ideas, and they did. You know, so that, like, be curious and just like go for it. You know, like I'm sort of, I don't know where this comes from, like in my personality, honestly. You know, but I think like you have to go for stuff. Like it's just so easy to just kind of like be too risk averse and just too like, you have to just throw yourself into stuff. You know, things, sometimes you fail, you know, sometimes it doesn't work. Okay, fine, just keep going, believe in yourself, you know, just go for it. Like I think that's the thing in academia. You see like people who are successful is because they can just like throw aside their inhibitions and just like go for something.
I was hearing you this morning, and something I liked that you mentioned there was that if you fail, you just need to keep trying.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. If you don't fail, you're not experimenting enough.
Mm-hmm.
You're bound to fail. Like it's just inevitable. Yeah. But that you have to learn how to be resilient and kind of, you know, like I'm sure that's true in business. Also, business people, you have to risk failure. You just have to go for something. You know, you have to like, you know, how did Elon Musk, you know, build all of that? You know, just by going for it. You know, and convincing other people that he had great ideas and just. He could have failed completely. I'm sure there's hundreds of people who failed completely. We don't know who they are because they don't go down in history. But you know, as I said, I don't know much about the private sector, but I can imagine it's very similar from that perspective. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you. This is the first episode, and we had the pleasure to talk to James Robinson. It's been an honor. It's really a big pleasure to have someone like you with this knowledge to be in this podcast and also sharing your knowledge with all these tech talks that you have. It's really good. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you enjoyed the university, and I hope you enjoyed concert. It's really beautiful. So
yeah, it's been fantastic.
A pleasure.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes,
thank you
it's
very
been
much.
great.